The cowboy had learned the language of silence better than most men learned prayer. Winters on the high plains taught it to him how the wind could scrape words off a man's mouth, how loneliness could settle into the bones like old shrapnel. His name was Elias Cole, and for 15 years he had lived alone on a spread of land, so wide that a man could ride from dawn to dusk and still not find its edge. People said he chose that life, that he was made for solitude, the way some men were made for violence or drink. Elias knew better. Solitude was not a talent. It was a scar that had healed wrong. The land around his cabin lay under a hard winter sky, pale and unforgiving. Snow had fallen 3 days straight, smoothing the world into a single color, erasing fences and trails alike. The cattle stood bunched together near the windbreak, their breath steaming like ghosts. Elias moved among them earlier that day with practiced efficiency, checking feed, checking legs, checking eyes. He spoke to them only when necessary, his voice rough and low, as if too much sound might crack something inside him. He had turned women away before, more than he could count without effort. They came in warmer seasons when roads were passable and hope traveled easily. Some arrived laughing too loudly, trying to fill the space before it swallowed them. Others watched him carefully, weighing his land, his shoulders, his silence. A few stayed long enough to think they were different. None were. Elias always ended it the same way, polite, distant, final. He never explained that the quiet they found romantic was the same quiet that had buried his brother, that had followed him home from a shallow grave and never left. As evening settled in, he sat at his rough table, the lamp throwing a small circle of light against the dark. He was mending a torn glove, thick fingers clumsy but patient with the needle. The fire was low and he intended to let it burn down. He preferred the cold at night. It reminded him he was still alive. Outside, the wind rose, pushing snow against the walls in long, restless sighs. The knock came once, firm and deliberate. Elias froze, needle paused mid-stitch. No one came out here in winter unless they were desperate or foolish, and neither kind survived long. He set the glove aside and stood, every sense alert. The rifle leaned against the wall, and he rested a hand near it as he crossed the room. The knock came again, quieter this time, as if whoever stood outside understood restraint. When he opened the door, cold rushed in like an animal. A woman stood on the threshold alone, snow dusting her shoulders and hair. She wore a plain wool cloak, well worn but clean, and boots meant for walking far. Her face was pale from the cold, but her eyes were steady, dark and unflinching. "I'm not selling anything," she said before he could speak. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "And I'm not lost." Elias studied her in silence. He had learned long ago that words gave away more than they protected. "Then you shouldn't be here," he said at last. "I know," she replied. "That's why I came." The wind shoved at her back, urging her forward. Elias considered closing the door. He had done so before, even on men he recognized, but something in her stillness gave him pause. She did not plead. She did not smile. "You'll freeze if you stay out there," he said. She nodded once. Yes. That was answer enough, apparently. He stepped aside, the decision made without thought. She crossed the threshold, the door closing behind her with a solid thud that seemed louder than it should have been. She stamped snow from her boots and pushed back her hood. Dark hair fell loose, slightly damp from melting ice. She did not look around in curiosity or judgment. She simply stood, hands at her sides, breathing in the warmth. "My name is Mara," she said. Elias inclined his head. He did not offer his own.
He took a tin cup from the shelf and poured her coffee, black and strong.
He set it on the table and returned to his chair. She accepted it, wrapping her hands around the metal with a quiet sigh. Her fingers trembled just a little. The cabin was small, every object placed for purpose, not comfort. A single bed, narrow and hard. "One chair, one table." Tools hung neatly on the wall. Mara's gaze moved slowly, taking it in without comment. Elias waited for the questions. Where was his family? Why did he live alone? Why had no woman stayed? None came. Instead, she said, "You live like a man preparing to disappear." The words struck him harder than a shout would have. He felt his jaw tighten. "Finish your coffee," he said. "Then I'll hitch you a horse." She lifted her eyes to him. "You won't." Outside, the wind howled, rattling the door. Snow scraped against the window like fingernails. Elias felt something shift in his chest, an old, uncomfortable sensation. He did not like being spoken to as if he were known. You don't know anything about me, he said. Mara took a slow sip of coffee. I know enough, she replied. Enough to knock. Silence settled between them, thick and heavy, but not hostile. Elias returned to his glove, though he did not stitch. His thoughts drifted unwillingly to winters past, nights when fever burned through him, and he woke unsure if he would see morning, times when a second voice in the room would have meant survival instead of chance. The lamp flickered. The fire popped once. Mara sat still, as if she understood that whatever came next would not be decided by words. And for the first time in many years, Elias Cole felt the certainty of his solitude crack, just slightly, like ice under unseen weight. Morning arrived without color. The storm had exhausted itself sometime before dawn, leaving the world buried and hushed, as if creation itself were holding its breath. Pale light seeped through the frost-edged window, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. Elias woke in his chair where he had slept sitting upright. His back stiff, the fire reduced to a bed of dull embers. For a moment he forgot there had been another person in the room. Then he heard the quiet scrape of a pan and smelled coffee warming, and his body tensed with an instinct older than thought. Mara stood at the small stove, her cloak folded neatly on a peg by the door. She had found his supplies without rummaging, using only what was needed. There was no apology in her movements, no assumption of permission, only a calm practicality that unsettled him more than intrusion would have. She turned when she sensed him awake, meeting his gaze as if they had been sharing the space for years rather than hours. The snow's deep, she said. Your horse won't manage it yet. Elias rose, joints protesting, and looked out the window. The land was gone, replaced by an unbroken field of white that swallowed fence posts and trails alike. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Winter always did this, shrinking the world until a man was forced to face himself. He nodded once, acknowledging what they both already knew. They ate in silence. The sound of cutlery against tin seemed louder than it should have been. Elias expected questions now, explanations, gratitude. Instead, Mara spoke only to state what was obvious. The cattle would need feed dug out. The water trough would be frozen solid. There was work to be done, and the storm did not care that two strangers shared a roof. She followed him outside without being asked, pulling on gloves he kept by the door. The cold bit hard, sharp enough to draw breath from the lungs. Elias watched her walk through the snow, steady and deliberate, and wondered how far she had already come to stand here. She did not complain when the work cut into her hands or when the wind stole warmth faster than she could reclaim it. She moved like someone accustomed to enduring rather than conquering. By late afternoon, exhaustion weighed on him heavier than the cold. They returned to the cabin, boots left by the door, steam rising from their clothes. Elias sat heavily, rubbing his hands together, the ache in his bones deeper than usual. He felt older in that moment than he had in years. Why me? He asked finally, the words rough from disuse. Mara did not answer right away. She poured water, set it to boil, and then stood by the window. The light outside had shifted, the sky pale and endless. Because you understand survival, she said at last. And because you understand its cost. Elias gave a short, humorless laugh. You think that makes me special? No, she said. I think it makes you honest. He turned away, anger flaring unexpectedly. You don't know what you're asking, he said. You don't know what kind of man I am. Mara faced him then, her expression unreadable. I'm not asking for stories, she replied. I'm asking a question. He shook his head, pacing the narrow space. Women come here thinking silence is peace. It's not. It eats you. It takes things you don't notice are gone until they're needed. She stepped closer, careful not to crowd him. I know, she said quietly. I've lived it too. The admission hung between them. Elias stopped pacing. He saw then that whatever had driven her to his door was not curiosity or desperation, but recognition, a shared understanding of what loneliness did over time. The fire crackled, louder now as fresh wood caught. Outside, the world remained buried, but the wind had stilled. Mara stood close enough that he could feel her warmth. She did not touch him. Instead, she leaned in, her voice barely more than breath against his ear. Another winter alone. Or a wife. The words struck him with a force he did not expect. Not because they were bold, but because they were simple. Elias felt years of solitude rush through him in a single heartbeat. The nights spent, counting rafters, the meals eaten in silence, the times he had imagined speaking just to hear a human voice and then stopped himself. He saw his own future stretched out, identical winters repeating until there was no one left to remember him. "I don't know how to be what you want," he said quietly. "I'm not kind. I'm not gentle." Mara met his eyes. "I don't want promises," she said. "I want truth." He searched her face for expectation, for calculation. He found none. Only patience. Only the willingness to stand beside him and face whatever came without illusions. Something inside him, long dormant, stirred, not hope. Exactly, but acceptance. Elias nodded once, the movement small but decisive. He felt as if he had stepped onto uncertain ground, aware it might give way, but choosing to stand anyway. Mara did not smile. She only let out a slow breath as if she had been holding it for a very long time. That night the cabin felt different. The silence remained, but it no longer pressed in on him. It rested, companionable, broken by the soft sounds of another person moving through the space. Elias lay awake for a long time, listening to the fire, to the wind easing outside, to the steady presence of a life no longer separate from his own. Winter did not end that night. The work did not lighten. But when dawn came again, Elias no longer greeted it alone. And for the first time in years, the thought did not frighten him.